The world dissolved into a storm of noise and dirt. Just moments before, I had been peering through the dense, humid air from the relative safety of a burned-out Buddhist temple, my Aeroflex camera a heavy, solid extension of my own eyes. My job was to capture the chaos, not become a part of it. But in Vietnam, the line between observer and participant was a ghost, a myth you told yourself to keep from going mad. Now that line had been obliterated by an RPG. The blast was a physical blow, a deafening roar that picked me up and threw me like a discarded doll. I landed a good 15 feet from where I'd been standing, my ears screaming with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the continuing chatter of AK-47s. For a moment, there was nothing but the taste of dust and cordite, the jarring shock of impact, and a profound ringing silence in the middle of a battle. I pushed myself up, my body a collection of aches and bruises I couldn't yet catalog. Nearby, the ABC cameraman who had been beside me was spitting out chipped pieces of his own teeth. We should have been dead. We both knew it. The yells of the grunts reached me then, muffled and distant through the ringing. They were asking if the guys in the temple were okay. Okay? The word seemed absurd. I scrambled on my hands and knees, my one thought to find cover, to find my partner. "Powell!" I yelled, my voice sounding thin and alien. "Stay there! I'll come around." More fighting erupted, and I hit the ground again, hugging the earth as rounds snapped through the air above me. This was my second major firefight, and the raw primal fear was just as potent as the first time. But this was different. This time, I was alone, wounded, and my partner had vanished into the very chaos I was supposed to be documenting. My war had begun only a few months earlier, on February 23, 1968, though it felt like a lifetime ago. The flight into Tan Son Nhut was a harbinger of things to come. Commercial airliners don't typically land like controlled crashes, but ours did, dropping out of the sky at an impossible angle to avoid ground fire from the remnants of the Tet Offensive. Stepping out of the plane wasn't a relief, it was an immersion. The air was a thick blanket of humidity, jet fuel, and something else, something acrid and unsettling. The terminal itself was a wreck, a huge gaping hole torn in the roof where a partisan rocket had landed just hours before. Debris was everywhere. There were no welcoming committees, just the grim reality of a war that had just announced it was far from over. Welcome to Vietnam, a Navy vehicle, driven by a guy from our unit, picked up the three of us, Brian Grigsby, Craig Farrell, and me, and took us to the villa that would be our home. It was a strange-looking building, constructed from what looked like oversized concrete blocks, surrounded by a fence topped with barbed wire. It wasn't a palace, but after what I'd learned of life in the field, it might as well have been a castle. It was a place with air conditioning, a place to sleep without the constant threat of mortars. The 14 of us who lived there shared rooms, 3 men to a space, with footlockers and chests of drawers for our gear. The showers were fed by water heated by the sun, a luxury that made the late afternoon a race to get clean before the warmth faded. The city of Saigon itself was a perimeter of light and sound at night. Because of the recent offensive, we had to pull guard duty, something the guys before us never had to do. I'd stand on the roof and watch a surreal laser light show unfold. C-130s would drop massive flares that drifted down on parachutes, bathing the edges of the city in a stark, artificial daylight. Mortars would send up their own smaller fleeting stars, and you could see the lazy red arcs of tracer rounds stitching patterns in the distant darkness. Sometimes they'd call in a gunship, puff the magic dragon, and it would unleash a torrent of fire that looked like someone was pouring light onto the earth from a garden hose. They told me that in 1 second, it could cover a football field, a round in every square foot. From the top of our villa, it was an incredible, terrifying spectacle. During the day, the city buzzed with a nervous energy, a place of stark contrast where the machinery of war ground alongside the rhythms of daily life. My first assignment out in the field was with Harry Breedlove, one of the best cinematographers in DASPO. I was still green, unsure of what to pack, what to expect. Harry was my guide. He knew the nuances of this war, the small details that told the larger story. We were heading into I Corps on a search and destroy mission with the 101st Airborne. The objective was a village that had been identified as a support base for local combatants. The weight of the gear was the first shock. Beyond the sea rations, awful leftovers from the Korean War that were only made edible with a liberal dousing of Tabasco sauce, and the canteens of water, there was the equipment. I carried a wind-up 16mm Bell & Howell camera, a durable workhorse, and about 20 rolls of film. The film alone was 20 pounds. Add a still camera, and the weight became a constant, nagging presence on your shoulders and back. We seldom carried weapons. It was an individual choice, and the extra weight and hassle just seemed to get in the way. If you needed one, there was usually one lying on the ground somewhere. It was a grim calculus, but a practical one. The walk was grueling, a long, sweaty march through terrain that seemed determined to drain every ounce of energy from you. We were filming the 101st as they rounded up villagers. Then, parts of the village were set on fire. That was my first real taste of the ugliness of the work we were doing. It wasn't open combat, but it was the cold, methodical application of destruction. At that point, I still believed we were there for the right reasons, more of a hawk than a dove. But seeing those homes burn, I felt the first stirrings of a deep and unsettling conflict within me. This was far more complicated than stopping communism. Later that evening, as dusk settled, we were waiting for Huey choppers to extract us and take us back to the fire base at Chulai. That's when I first came under fire. It started with a soft thump in the distance, followed by a whistling sound that grew rapidly louder. Then, an explosion rocked the ground 100 yards away. Mortars. They were walking them in. A spotter somewhere in the hills directing the fire right into our camp. There was no enemy to shoot at, no direction to the threat, just death falling from the sky. Harry yelled to head for the sandbags, and we scrambled for the flimsy protection of a shallow bunker, just a few layers of sandbags piled up. I pressed myself to the earth, feeling utterly helpless, my entire world reduced to the desperate hope that the next round wouldn't land on top of me. It was a fear unlike any other, a complete and total surrender of control. The feeling never changed, no matter how many times it happened. If anything, it got worse. The choppers finally came in after the barrage stopped, and we scrambled aboard, my heart still hammering against my ribs. Back at the villa, the routine was always the same. Clean up, type the captions for the film, detailing the who, what, where, and when of every shot, and get the footage ready for the next flight out to the Army Pictorial Center in New York. I spent probably 90% of that first TDY up in I Corps, where the action was heaviest. One day on a trip to the massive supply dump at Long Bin, the sheer scale of the American military machine hit me. It was a vast, sprawling junkyard of everything the military couldn't fix or no longer wanted. Wrecked jeeps, tanks, howitzers, shell casings, even typewriters and parts of mobile homes. It stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to a level of waste I couldn't comprehend. Vietnamese scrap dealers were there with huge trucks, hauling away the refuse of our war. On the way back, we drove through the area where the general officers lived. They had huge air-conditioned trailers with manicured lawns and barbecue grills. The contrast between their lives and the lives of the grunts I'd just left in the field was sickening. It was a stark lesson in the hierarchies of war. The men on the ground, the grunts, were a different breed altogether. They were professionals, brave and determined. Watching them move on a village, the way the point men operated, the way the officers, at least the ones I worked with, cared for their men, it was a study in gritty competence. There was a camaraderie forged in shared misery and danger that was unbreakable. But back in our own unit at the villa, things were more complex. We had our share of officers who never left Saigon and NCOs who seemed to exist only to manage the maids and pay the bills. They had likely paid their dues in Korea or earlier in Vietnam, but it created a divide between the guys who went out and the guys who stayed in. My next major assignment was covering the relief of Acheson. It was a big story, and the flight in was an education in itself. I happened to jump on a chopper with General Creighton Abrams. He was an affable man, a madman behind the controls. He wasn't even licensed to fly the thing, but he kicked the co-pilot out of his seat and took the stick himself. We flew down a winding riverbed, no more than 10 feet off the water, the jungle canopy a blur of green on either side. It was beautiful, a vision of what this country could be, what it was before we arrived. It looked like Shangri-La. Then Abrams pulled back on the stick, and we rose up and over the ridge. The world below transformed in an instant. The lush green vanished, replaced by a gray, pock-marked hellscape that looked like the surface of the moon. There was no foliage, no life, just an endless vista of overlapping craters from B-52 strikes and artillery barrages. The sheer destructive power was beyond anything I could have imagined. We landed at Acheson, and I spent the day filming the grimy, exhausted Marines, the abandoned, shot-up aircraft on the runway. The place was a rat-infested, dusty, ugly monument to human endurance and folly. From Acheson, I moved to the Spacial Valley with the 1st Cavalry Division. The Pentagon was hungry for combat footage after Tet, and the pressure was on us to deliver. But the Spacial, for all its notorious history, was quiet. We patrolled for days through soggy, bomb-cratered terrain, a landscape so ravaged it was a challenge just to walk, let alone maneuver troops and supplies. We made no contact. The downtime was agonizing. Waiting for a flight out, sitting on a hot, dusty runway, the acidic smell of phantom jet exhaust filling the air. It was a unique form of misery. I hated it. I knew the 101st was coming in on the southern end of the valley, so I decided to make my own way there, hoping to find the action the brass wanted. It was a frustrating, fruitless search. The pressure to get combat footage was immense, and coming back empty-handed felt like a failure. It was then I made a decision that would define the rest of my time in Vietnam. If I wanted combat, I knew exactly where to find it. I started going to the medevac hospitals and hitching rides out to the hot landing zones, the places where they were picking up the wounded. It was a conscious choice to put myself directly in harm's way, but it was the only way I knew to do my job. That decision led me to a Michelin rubber plantation with Ken Powell. We were waiting with a medevac crew when a call came in. Wounded men from the 25th Infantry Division. We jumped on the dust-off chopper and flew into a scene of utter chaos. The pilot set the chopper down in the middle of a firefight, a testament to the incredible bravery of those crews. We landed with a small armored squad, a couple of tanks and a few APCs that was pinned down on a narrow road inside the plantation, taking fire from 3 different directions. The first thing we filmed was the wounded being loaded onto our chopper. Then we ran for the cover of the commander's APC. The captain in charge was a savvy guy who had been through Tet, but he had no idea what he had run into. Both of his tanks were taken out by RPGs, and his small force was being flanked. The incoming fire was intense, tree limbs splintering and leaves raining down around us. Later, when I had a chance to get stills made from the 16mm footage, you could actually see the shapes of the northern soldiers in the foliage, running and shooting. I had no flak jacket, just my helmet and a canteen of water. The stress and fatigue were immense, like playing a football game on the hottest day imaginable while people are shooting at you. The captain was getting orders from a general to stay and engage the enemy all night. With only a half hour of daylight left and his force on the verge of being completely surrounded, the captain made a decision. He feigned a bad radio connection, claiming he couldn't understand the general's orders, and made the call to pull out. It was a good thing he did. We backed out of there, linking up with the rest of his company, and formed a defensive circle around what turned out to be a small island of trees. We had stumbled into the middle of a North Vietnamese Army division-level training center. The night was an apocalyptic symphony of destruction. Our position was pounded by artillery and aircraft, the ground shaking so violently with each explosion that it felt like it would split open. I threw my poncho down, ate a can of cold sea rations, and tried to sleep, but the earth just kept moving. I finally drifted off around 3 in the morning, only to be woken at 5 by the arrival of 2 more companies of infantry. We went back in. The advance was slow, held up by snipers who were covering their comrades' retreat. They had left in a hurry, leaving behind a trove of intelligence material, tiger cages that held our POWs, and a lot of booby traps. Things kept blowing up as guys touched things they shouldn't have. I asked the captain where the safest place to be was, and he told me to stay in his command APC. Before I could climb in, I was outside filming, and as RPGs started coming in, I scrambled inside. The sound of rounds clinking off the armor was a terrifying, oddly reassuring sound. You knew you were in the right place. As we moved through the abandoned camp, I looked up into the trees. I'm not exaggerating when I say there were 50 or 60 unexploded cluster bombs hanging in the branches, snagged by the heavy canopy on their way down. I couldn't help but wonder what a good breeze might do. I was just glad we hadn't stayed there to engage them all night. We would have been overrun. That was my true baptism by fire, which brings me back to the burned-out temple and the RPG. After the blast, I found a sergeant who had been shot in the stomach, but I still couldn't find Powell. He was gone. The company moved on, blowing up the bunkers as they went, and there was no sign of him. As dusk fell, my camera became useless. The film speed, the ASA, was too low for the fading light. The last shots I got were of two Huey gunships flying low overhead, their rockets and machine guns pouring fire into the bunkers, the rounds looking like they were literally going right over our heads. After that, I was just a man with a heavy, useless piece of equipment. The fight continued in sporadic bursts. A new guy in the unit, barely in country for a couple of weeks, spotted a northern soldier's head pop up from a bunker. He ran over and tossed a grenade in, but he didn't count. He just threw it. The grenade came flying back out almost as fast as it went in. Someone yelled, "Fire in the hole!" and I dove. The explosion was sharp and violent. I felt a sharp sting in my left cheek and another in my rear. I didn't think it was shrapnel. I thought it was just pieces of rubble from the blast. I had no water, and everywhere we went that night, someone was shooting at us. We stopped walking around 2 in the morning in a flooded rice paddy. A water buffalo stood silently in the dark, watching us. Another soldier let me use his canteen. I filled it with the sludgy paddy water, dropped in a handful of iodine pills, and filtered it through my teeth. It was the best drink of water I have ever had in my life. I was carrying a huge camera, a battery belt, a flak vest, and an M16. I must have looked like the biggest dork in the world. I was dehydrated, terrified of stepping on a mine, and incredibly angry at Ken Powell for running off and getting us into this mess. The next morning, as we finally walked back to the fire base, a medic saw me in the light. He told me I was covered in blood. That's when I heard a voice. "Hey, I've been worried about you, man." It was Ken Powell. He had caught a ride on a medevac APC back to the base hours ago, as soon as the main firing had died down. All night I had been scared for him, scared for myself, and he had been safe at the base. I took a chopper to an aid station in Pubai, got the shrapnel dug out of me and stitched up. Powell found the whole thing humorous. I found myself the recipient of a Purple Heart, a decoration I knew would bring me a lot of razzing from the other guys. That same day, the second Tet Offensive of 1968 was in full swing, and Saigon was being overrun again. Tan Son Nhut was shut down. Getting a flight out of Pubai was nearly impossible. I finally found an old DC-3 from Air America, a civilian airline run by the CIA. The inside of the plane was a chaotic scene of pigs, Montagnard tribesmen, and bales of something that smelled horrible. I was just happy to have a ride. The landing in Saigon was one of the worst of my life. The plane came down on one wheel, bounced sideways onto the other, and skidded down a runway surrounded by the flashes of tracers and flares. I was sure that was it, but the pilot pulled it out. We had made it. After that trip, I eventually rotated back to Hawaii, but my reprieve was short-lived. I was supposed to go to Thailand, a country I loved, but orders changed. A guy from our unit, whose wife had come down with spinal meningitis, was sent back to the States. I was sent back to Vietnam on August 13th to replace him. I was one of the last people in the world who wanted to go back. I felt like the odds were stacking against me with every day I spent in that country. My first assignment on my third tour was to cover the first withdrawal of troops under President Nixon's new Vietnamization policy. We were up at Cam Ranh Bay, waiting for the official word. After several false starts, we finally got the call. The scene was a staged media event. A band played, stewardesses kissed the soldiers as they boarded the plane, and I filmed it all with a sync sound camera. I shot for what felt like an eternity, long after the plane pulled away. When I checked my camera, I realized my mistake. I had shot 800 feet of film, an impossibility on a 400-foot roll. In all my careful preparation, I had forgotten to properly load the film in the gate. I had nothing, but luck was with me. There was a second plane. The whole dog and pony show was repeated, and this time my camera was loaded correctly. The American public saw the second group of soldiers leave Vietnam, and no one was the wiser. I never had any confidence that Vietnamization would work. The South Vietnamese army, from what I saw, had no will to win. The graph started at the very top and trickled all the way down to the poor soldiers who had their families with them in the field, their paychecks skimmed by every NCO and officer above them. They were conscripts, not patriots. They would rather have the Americans fight their war for them. The North Vietnamese regulars and the local partisans, on the other hand, had an unshakable belief that they were fighting for their country. They were tough, resourceful, and willing to endure anything to win. It felt like our own Revolutionary War. They were fighting for one Vietnam, not a North and a South. Life at the villa continued with its strange mix of boredom and terror. We played poker, drank beer, and listened to music. The Beatles, the Doors, the Mamas and the Papas. We'd go down to the 5 o'clock follies, the daily press briefing at the Rex Hotel, and laugh at the exaggerated body counts and stories of winning the hearts and minds of the people. It was a joke, and everyone knew it. The dogs didn't like the dog food, and nobody was buying what the government was selling. I did a story for Congress on the problems with the Sherman tank, which kept overheating and getting stuck in rice paddies. I flew with my cousin, a forward air commander in the Air Force, down in the Delta. He flew a tiny prop plane, and the contortions he put it through made me sicker than a dog. I threw up in my jungle hat, much to his amusement. I never made that mistake again, but I did fly with him often, documenting a side of the war I wouldn't have otherwise seen. One of my most rewarding projects was a documentary on setting up and tearing down artillery fire bases. It was a massive undertaking, and we had the full cooperation of the commanders in Vietnam. Our team, Tom Mentier, John Gilroy, Joe Primo, and myself, filmed every aspect of the process. For our efforts, I was awarded Cinematographer of the Year by the Department of Defense. But the job itself was grueling. We were in the Parrot's Beak, an area that jutted into Cambodia, and the dust from the Sikorsky helicopters was unbelievable. It got into everything. When we got back to the base camp, we were so filthy that people literally walked away from us. They just gave us new fatigues and pointed us to the showers. I filmed the 1 millionth soldier to go on R&R, a river rat from the Mekong Delta. We spent 2 weeks with him, capturing his life on the river and his excitement about meeting his wife in Hawaii. We got him to Saigon to shop for gifts, finished the job, and sent the film to Washington. We later heard he got a Dear John letter right before he was supposed to leave. The Army, embarrassed, quietly picked another guy and sent a different DASPO team to film him. The last combat assignment I had was another search and destroy mission in I Corps, near Con Thien. The mission was to blow up some bunkers that had been spotted. They weren't using C4, but sacks of tear gas powder that they would detonate. Nobody told me to bring a gas mask. The powder seeped out of every hole in the ground, drifting on the humid air. My eyes were streaming, my nose was running, and I could hardly see. As I stumbled away from the gas, I ran straight into a bramble bush that was swarming with red ants. The heat, the gear, the gas, the ants. I remember just thinking, what a great day. My final assignment in Vietnam was on an island 10 miles off the coast of Hue. A small group of American servicemen, an Air Force guy, a Marine Seabee, an Army guy, and a Navy guy, were working with the village elders to rebuild their community. Instead of just giving them money, they were helping them build bridges and infrastructure. They were heroes to the local people. I took a guy named Stu Barbie with me. Stu had been working in the morgue on a gruesome training film about identifying bodies, and the experience had deeply affected him. I thought the trip would do him good. We got to the island, scouted our locations, and planned our shoot. Then the monsoon hit. It rained for a solid week. We never shot a single frame of film, but it was a week away from the war. I spent the time reading The Lord of the Rings. The village priest had us over for dinner, and as the guests of honor, Stu and I were presented with the delicacy, boiled chicken heads. I left Vietnam for the last time on December 26, 1969. The war had made me a fatalist, hardened me to things no young man should have to see. It had taken friends from me, shown me the best and worst of humanity, and given me a craft that would define the rest of my life. Within 10 days of leaving that world of chaos and dust, I was back in a college classroom. The transition was jarring, the two realities impossible to reconcile. The skills I had learned under fire, the eye for story and composition, I now applied to my degree and then to a master's. I built a career on the foundation forged in Vietnam, working for years as a producer of national commercials, eventually owning my own production company. The war had given me a profession, but it had taken a part of my youth that I could never get back. For years, I avoided the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. I was afraid of the emotional breakdown I knew would come from seeing the names, especially the name of my best friend, Rick Ryan, carved into that polished black granite. I finally went with my DASPO reunion group, surrounded by the men who understood, who had been there. There was a lot of emotional support in that shared silence. Standing there, tracing the letters of his name, the war finally felt like it had a beginning, a middle, and now a quiet, profound end. The experiences, the friendships, the ghosts, they remain. I think of Rick every week. I see the faces of the grunts, the pilots, the other cameramen, and I remember the strange, terrible, and transformative journey that took a kid from a blue-collar town in Michigan and sent him halfway around the world to document a war that would change him and his country forever.